Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Rector, and I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And I'm also one of the organizers for a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth, who is working to help find solutions for the problem of climate change. And today we are especially pleased to have for our Q&A session, Dr. Kristina Dahl, who, if you haven't seen her original talk, there will be a link for that on YouTube in the comment section. So I do highly recommend that you go watch that first. So the purpose of this session is to be a Q&A and just an informal discussion about the many topics that Dr. Dahl brought up in her initial talk. So thank you, Christy, and welcome for joining us again today.
So happy to be here with you all.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm especially looking forward to our conversation today, because I think one of the biggest challenges for scientists in general, and I think especially for astronomers, is that of advocacy. We've done surveys of our membership for Astronomers for Planet Earth, and there's a lot of concern and skepticism about whether or not scientists should be advocating. Should we be going to Capitol Hill? Should we be talking to politicians? Should we be teaching about particular solutions? And I think the biggest concern people have is, are we somehow are we no longer in the role of scientists, and are we now in the role of hacks or policy wonks, or are we somehow I guess no longer, are we somehow, well, you know what I'm trying to say. We're not being scientists anymore. So the first question I'd like to start off with is just, what do you say to that? I mean, I'm sure you've talked with many scientists who have similar concerns. So how do you help scientists understand what their roles should be? How can they be true to their roles as scientists, but also be advocates for solutions?
I think it's a great question, and it's certainly one that I don't think we get much training on when we are training as scientists at the undergraduate or graduate level. I think certainly in my case, there was this perception that if you stepped outside of the bounds of your lane in science and said anything that wasn't related to your science and your research in particular, that you could be discredited, right? That you would sort of lose the weight and the gravitas that comes along with being an academic scientist. So yes, this is something I hear a lot, including from my colleagues from graduate school, who some of whom are comfortable in stepping into advocacy roles and some of whom are simply not. So I would say that either of those is okay. If you are not comfortable advocating for climate change because it's outside of your discipline, that's okay. But we do want to make it more acceptable for scientists who do want to step into that advocacy role to do so. And surveys by our organization and some scientists who are affiliated with our organization have shown that scientists who do step into those advocacy roles typically do receive support from their colleagues for their advocacy work, and they don't find that they're losing any credibility. So I would just put that out there as some evidence that you can step into this role, and even though it's not something that's necessarily encouraged in academic environments, it's also not something that people view as negatively as you might perceive. The other thing I would say is that you're scientists, but you're also people living on this planet. And I think many people who are scientists or non-scientists see what's happening right now with climate change and feel compelled to do something about it. And what people choose to do about it is going to depend on what their experience is and what their knowledge base is. And as scientists, you have the ability to read the scientific literature in ways that perhaps someone in the general public does not. And so you can pick up the original research, and as a scientist, you can have an informed opinion about it. And as a human being who cares about this planet and all the planets beyond, you can and should feel comfortable raising your voice and saying what you believe needs to happen in terms of addressing climate change. There's tons of evidence out there. There's tons of public resources out there to help you kind of feel like you're on firm footing when it comes to the understanding of climate science and the potential policy options that are out there. So yeah, I guess I would say that, you know, you can wear your scientist hat, but also recognize that it's on the head of a concerned person living on this earth.
So do you think it's maybe a good idea for people to say, you know, as a scientist, I know this is happening, but as a citizen, here's what I think we should do. Do you think it's maybe that might be a way to help scientists feel like they can, you know, define what their role is in that particular moment?
Sure, yeah, and we certainly hear scientists who are working at federal agencies doing that because they're somewhat constrained in what type of advocacy work and what they can officially say from their positions as federal scientists. And so we often see them, you know, publishing their scientific literature, scientific results, but then when they step into the advocacy space, they'll do it as a private citizen, right? And, you know, they can have PhD or master's or whatever their credentials are behind their title, but not necessarily list their institution. So that's the way that federal scientists are navigating that. I would also say that you can say, you know, as a scientist, I've looked at this research and evaluated it, and this is what I see. But the same holds true for the policy space, right? You could pick up that literature as well and say, this is what our, you know, policy experts say is needed to address this problem. You don't necessarily need to come up with those solutions yourself, or you know, it is helpful always to think through what your own opinion is, of course, on something, and to think critically about what you're reading. But it doesn't necessarily have to be your ideas that you're advocating for. There's plenty of research out there, you know, showing what the benefits of a carbon tax would be versus a cap and trade policy. So you can really lean on not just the scientific literature, but the policy research that's out there as well.
Interesting. So I'll just mention to everyone who's here, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to type it into the chat session, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you to ask a question. So William has his hand up. William, if you'd like to ask a question, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi. Now, you've mentioned that your background in paleoclimatology has helped you. Well, you can appreciate the importance of modern day climate change from your own perspective, because you've looked at climate change in the past over geological timescales. So what has that taught you about modern day climate change that others may not quite appreciate? Maybe even other climatologists don't quite see see it the way you see it. And what do the various media keep saying that you find is maybe a little bit frustrating and not quite right?
It's a good question. So having done my PhD work in paleoclimatology and looking at you know, geological scales of climate change on the, you know, thousands to tens of thousands of years scales, what I see now happening with climate change is just unprecedented in terms of the pace and the magnitude of the changes that we're experiencing. That doesn't mean that there haven't been times in Earth's history when we've been warmer than we are today, because there have been, but certainly not in the present geologic era. So knowing the pace of climate change in the past and the scale of the change in the past and comparing that to what's happening today really does give me a level of concern that compels me to raise my voice about these issues. It's certainly not something that I saw in any of the records that I was looking at as a paleoclimate person. But I think I also, you know, before I dove in on paleoclimate, I was, you know, earth sciences major as an undergraduate. So thinking on the sort of millions of years time scale, billions of years. And, you know, one frequent question I get, or some perception that I think a lot of, you know, even, you know, educated adults have, is that global warming is going to kill off all human civilization, right? Or I'll have middle schoolers, for example, ask me like, is the Earth just going to die? And when you think about it on these geologic sort of timescales, to me, it's kind of comforting because the Earth has been through so much, and we are just this little blip at, you know, the most recent history of the Earth. And so even with the changes that we are forcing upon the Earth, I know that it will continue to be here, right? Long past when human civilization is over. I also know that humans can live in a wide range of environmental conditions. And that doesn't mean that we are making it any easier for people to live in, like tropical areas where it's going to be extremely warm. But I would not say that global warming is going to end human civilization, right? We're pretty adaptable. So I think those are a few things, the sort of common misperceptions I hear, that people really take it to extremes. Yeah, and from the paleo perspective, just this notion that Earth will continue, but we are pushing it in ways that we haven't pushed it before.
Thank
you. Leo, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you for your really nice talk, Christy. I actually watched it today while biking. New iPhone bike holder. That's quite nice to watch webinars.
Interesting.
I was most impressed by the 4 maps that you showed of the US, where essentially there is widespread consensus that you should regulate CO2 and that climate change is happening, and everyone agrees on these things, but then almost no one discusses it. And I was wondering, I mean, apart from, of course, that being bad and that being one of the reasons why we discuss here, and how can we improve that, I was wondering if that was different in the past for big issues, like, for example, when the ozone hole was a big issue in the 70s, 80s, and then there was global consensus that something needs to be done, and it worked successfully, right? Was that a wider issue at the time, or is it always only a small part of the community that discusses environmental problems, let's say?
That's a great question, and I don't know what the answer is. But that map in particular of there's the very low percentage of people in our country who regularly talk about climate change has been, it's very persistent. So that comes from these surveys that were done by a group at Yale, and they do them, I believe, annually. So, and they've gone back, I don't know, maybe 15 years or so. And that has been a very persistent issue. We just don't have people talking about climate change, despite the fact that we're seeing rising percentages of people in the country understanding that climate change is happening and accepting that humans are the cause. So, I think it's a really interesting parallel you're drawing with the ozone depletion, because back then it was a bipartisan issue for our legislators, and we were able to come together both, within our country and with other nations to adopt policies that would reverse the ozone depletion we were experiencing. And that's been extremely effective. I think our political climate is very different right now. And some of that has to do with the fact that the fossil fuel industry has been lobbying against climate policy for decades. And they have a very powerful voice in Washington with our legislators. So I think there's, a lot of our elected leaders have been discouraged from really taking this issue on. And that percolates down to their constituents as well.
Okay, so the problem is a bigger one, essentially, you're saying, right?
I think it is a bigger one. And, despite the fact that we have come together to address ozone depletion, that wasn't an issue that had this big disinformation campaign associated with it, right? We weren't up against like deep-pocketed industries to the extent that we are with the issue of climate change and fossil fuel emissions. So I think those may be some things that are contributing to that.
So I'm curious, Christy, when it comes to like talking about it, are you that person that you're at a dinner party and there's just some connection, like, boy, it was, really hot today or something? Are you that person that jumps in and starts talking about climate change? And if so, how does that go? I mean, how do you not become that person people don't want to invite over anymore because you're always just bringing up this thing that really just, hard to hear about? I mean, it's just depressing, of course.
It is hard to hear about, and I don't want to be that person. So, honestly, I try to keep climate change out of my social interactions, but people know what I do. And, for instance, with the Biden administration's recent executive orders that are addressing climate change and his recent appointments, we do have a lot of friends saying, hey, what do you think about this? And it's nice to be able to be positive about climate change in those conversations. But, I think often people approach the issue of climate change in social situations by falling back on some of these old tropes, like, oh, it's really cold today, it can't be global warming. And I get that a lot, right? And to me, that's an opening, right? Even if someone may be trying to goad me into an argument, it's an opportunity to talk about it. And it's signaling that on some level, that person wants to talk about this. So I do try to take opportunities, but I also try to take them lightly and to keep, the sort of professional work that I do about it from hindering any social interactions or conversations. So.
Okay. James, you've had your hand up for a while, so I want to give you an opportunity to ask or to talk.
Thanks, and thanks, Christy, and hi, everybody. I put in the chat a link to a reference. I wouldn't exactly call it a recommendation. I don't love that book of Andrew Hoffman's How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate, but he does address the issue that was just raised. Why don't people talk about it? His thesis is it's like smoking. 50 years ago, smoking was so ingrained in at least US culture that even if you were opposed to it, you couldn't say so. And if your teenage kid brought home a girlfriend or boyfriend and they lit up a cigarette in your living room and you didn't like it, you probably wouldn't even say anything about it. Today, that would be unheard of, totally unacceptable. And his point was 50 years ago, but there were plenty of people who knew that it caused cancer. The science was clear, but there was this cultural debate going on where it was taboo to talk about. And his thesis is climate change is still in that stage, and that we just have to wait. And that's the part I really disagree with. I don't like just wait 10 or 20 years and we'll get to that point. We don't have those 20 years. So maybe we could take something good from that point, which is, there's a culture issue here that we have to learn more about. Sorry, that was long. My real question for you, Christy, is how do you recommend balancing for us scientists we tend to pride ourselves on thinking logically and using facts and evidence, but we know that most people don't make decisions about their lifestyle based on science, facts, evidence, journal peer-reviewed papers. They base it on what their peer group says they should think about, what their religious leaders, their family leaders, or whoever their clan is, they want to belong socially to that clan. And that's where they're getting most of their information from, even if it's subliminal, subconscious. And we scientists, we don't really think much about connecting with people through their values and narratives and stories and all the things that communication experts say we should. Can you give some advice to us scientists for how to do better?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. It's something I struggle with, and it sort of breaks my heart to know that people don't make decisions based on facts and evidence. But I know that's what the facts and evidence tell us. So we should be believing that. So I think what you're getting at, this kind of social signaling that we do to one another that helps to shape a group's values and decisions is really important. And, I think there are some relatively subtle ways that you can start to inject that into conversations. For instance, your example of smoking and how taboo it would be today to, smoke in someone's home without asking, especially. You could equate that to something like vegetarianism, right? Which the facts and evidence tell us that industrial farming and the production of meat is a huge source of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's very taboo to tell someone to please don't eat meat. But you could say, if you're out to lunch with a friend, I'm trying to eat less meat. because I was reading about this thing. And it's not a judgment on them for doing or making their choice, that like getting a ham sandwich or whatever they want to get. But it starts to introduce this notion that, hey, these things are connected and we can take some action. I would say another opportunity for doing that is if you have a local election coming up. You know, we know that a lot of politicians take stands on the policies that they would like to enact locally to either reduce emissions or maybe they're not addressing it at all. And that's one place where if you're talking with your neighbors about you know, your local candidates for your city supervisors or however it's structured where you live, you can say, hey, I really like this person and I'm encouraged to see this in their plan. So I think those are, yeah, a couple of ways to start having those kinds of conversations. Another way is, you know, sometimes you'll read a really compelling story in the news. One of my go-tos is a story of these small islands in the Philippines that had an earthquake. So it's not climate change related. They had a major earthquake that dropped the island's elevation significantly. And now the island floods twice a day with every high tide. You know, water up to everyone's knees, kids are splashing through their schoolrooms. Parents have to elevate their kids' beds at night. I mean, it's just wild to think about, right? And those kinds of compelling stories, if we can hold them and recount them for people, can also help to shape people's views and take it out of the political realm, out of the personal choice realm, and say, gosh, you know, these people halfway around the world are dealing with this, and it's scary, and what do you think about it? So yeah, I would say drawing on some of the more compelling stories that you hear about in the news might be an interesting way to go to.
So Julia is asking me to tell a story of what is my shortest climate change lecture ever. And that is a couple of years ago, I was at a gas station in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And as I was pumping gas, the woman next to me, you know, it was a brutally hot day. And the woman next to me was like, boy, it sure is hot out today. And I said, yeah, I don't remember it ever, you know, it wasn't always this hot before. She's like, yeah. And that was it. That was the extent of our conversation about climate change. And, you know, it was, you know, of course, it was improvised and, you know, who knows what ultimate impact it was, but at least hopefully planted the seed of this idea. This is weird. This is unusual. It wasn't always like this. I mean, do you have those sorts of conversations with people? Is that like maybe a way of talking about climate change without, you know, breaking out the PowerPoints and the lectures and the facts and, you know, everyone feeling like they're being lectured? Is that, what do you think of that kind of
thing?
For
sure. You know, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the Midwest, and this past January, or I should say January 2020, they had a stretch of days in January that were like about 70 degrees. And so, you know, my parents were saying, yeah, this is really unusual. And I said, yes, like this is unusual. This is climate change. You don't I can name it because they're, you know, of like mind. But I think when we do have those weather related events that are so unusual, we all feel it. We all know it's unusual. I think naming it and just commenting on it, right? And if you're comfortable using the words climate change, or if you feel like the person you're speaking with would be too, then name it. And if not, just let it hang there. Like you're saying, Travis, with this interaction at a gas station, you can just say it and plant the seed.
Thank you. William, you have your hand up again. Please go ahead.
Right, thanks. Yeah, this is probably the best place to put in this question, since we're talking about how do we reach people. You actually speak to powerful politicians. So I have a number of questions about that, which I guess are pretty much related to each other. Are they really listening to you? What do you find that actually works when discussing climate change with them? In other words, the best way to make them understand. What doesn't work with them? And what do you find most frustrating in dealing with them?
So one of the things we have heard from politicians is that they want information that's specific, like in the House of Representatives, for example, they want information that's specific to their district. They want data, numbers, projections. And so our group really aims to try to provide those things. If we develop projections for the number of homes that will be affected by sea level rise, we break it down by congressional district so that when we go to those representatives, we can hand them a fact sheet and says, here's what we project for the people who live in your district. So I think getting very specific with politicians and saying, you know, whether it's your county, your district, your state, can be really helpful. And we know that they want that information as much as it might be hard to hear. In terms of whether they're listening or not, we do get a lot of interest and engagement from Democrats. It is much harder for us to engage with Republican offices. And we try very hard to, we reach out to them just like we reach out to Democratic offices, but we don't always get a response or the receptivity for a meeting. So that is difficult and we just keep trying. In terms of what's not effective, gosh, I would say alarmism and kind of scare tactics. So we see that within the climate community and certain, you know, factions of it. And I think really aiming to stick to what is scientifically known and defensible, you know, not taking it to that place of like, we're all going to die is effective because they know that there are parts of the environmental movement who are more fringe and do go to those more extremes. And what they really want is trusted information that can be vetted.
Right, thanks. But one thing, you say that we shouldn't be alarmist, but I mean, one of the reasons we're all here is because it is rather alarming. You can be scientific and things can still be very alarming.
Absolutely, and I think it's okay to say that. And I think in many cases, the numbers speak for themselves, right? If I tell a politician in Florida, you can expect to see 180 days per year when the heat index is going to be above 105. Like, I can say that, and I can say that's alarming to me, but it doesn't necessarily have to be coupled with the kind of, you know, all, you know, everyone is going to have to leave the state of Florida. You know, there's sort of a line you can draw where you can say, this is the data and I'm here because I'm alarmed about it. Without, to me, alarmist sort of connotes this definition of being false about your alarm that you're raising. And being alarmed is a very different thing.
Yeah, don't exaggerate, right?
Right, exactly.
So have you had success with, you know, taking maybe a different tack of saying, hey, look, you know, your state or your district can make a lot of money if they invest in, you know, these technologies. I mean, you could be creating jobs. I mean, obviously, I mean, jobs, right? It seems like 90%, that's what politicians want to know. Are they creating jobs in their district? Is that, I mean, have you had those conversations as well, or is that moving too far afield from the work that you do?
Yeah, it is a little far afield from the work that I do, though I do have colleagues who work more on the renewable energy side of things who do look into that kind of stuff. And in particular, when we look at things like like in the Midwest, where you have some coal plants that are closing, right? What's going to happen to those sites? And what does the community want to have happen to those sites? And engaging with those communities and helping them to come up with a vision for, you know, what it's going to look like economically in their community when this site closes has been really effective for us. And I don't know that it's percolated up to showing, you know, number of jobs to politicians, but it certainly helped communities to advocate for the kinds of changes they want to see. And some of those involve, you know, employment at the local plant, which might turn into, you know, a local solar facility or wind facility, something like that. And there are also studies out there that show kind of the benefits of climate adaptation actions. So Investing now in making infrastructure more resilient actually saves money down the road, because then when a disaster like a hurricane hits, the damage isn't as severe and you're not dealing with the disaster costs down the road. So we've tended to focus on that kind of stuff as well. That shows that, ultimately, while there might be some initial investment in upgrading infrastructure, say along the coast, it's going to pay off down the line. Sometimes that down the line isn't as compelling to politicians as we would hope it would be, but that is one tack we've taken.
Interesting. So I'll just mention Leo here has said he'd like to take a screenshot and tweet about this. So if anyone doesn't want their picture on here, though I think it will list your name probably, you might want to turn off your camera for a second so Leo can take that screenshot. God, I can't believe we have to do things like that. So here's I'd just like to ask you. So, I mean, what would you say when you're talking with politicians? What are like for those who are earnestly asking, like I'm sure there's a lot of politicians, if they meet with you at all, they may just feel like they're just doing it to be polite and they're not going to listen to you at all. But for those of you feel like are really engaged and they want to know how to do this. I mean, what are the questions they're asking and what are the answers that you're giving? And how do you help them see that this is a problem that that individual should be addressing?
Yeah, those are all good questions. I would say that communities want to know what they're going to be facing and when. So that sounds like a really simple thing, right? But that kind of information isn't always available at the local level. So we've tried hard to kind of address that need to say, here's one impact of climate change that we see for your area. And you can expect this change to happen by 2040, 2050, whenever it is. And in terms of what they can do about it, we often get asked, what communities are doing this well? Can you give me examples of communities that are proactively addressing climate change, making their communities more resilient, investing where the community's on board? And so we'll share examples of places that are taking some innovative routes. Places like Norfolk, Virginia, which is really vulnerable to sea level rise, relatively densely populated. And they have formed a regional compact that helps to advise communities so that they're all on the same page and all, say, using the same sea level rise projections, which wasn't always happening in the past. And they've also mapped out the city of Norfolk's into different zones and said, this is where this is an area that is going to be flooding more frequently, and we are not going to allow additional development in this area. This is an area that's going to stay dry, and we'll prioritize development here. So, being very explicit like that is something that not a lot of communities have been willing to do, and yet more and more communities need to think about. So we try to have a lot of examples like that in our back pocket that politicians from other places can relate to, and see that they're not going to be the only one going out on a limb.
I noticed in the news related to that, I've noticed in the news a couple of stories have been very disturbing about one is like when coal companies are going bankrupt. One is the jobs are just disappearing abruptly, that they're telling employees everything is fine, your jobs are okay, and then you show up for work the next day and everyone is handed a pink slip, right? And the other is that a lot of these mining companies are getting off the hook with having to clean up their sites, right? As part of the bankruptcy proceedings. I think there was in the news the other day about a company, I think it was in Kentucky, that was given an okay as part of bankruptcy to not clean up the damage they've done. I mean, is that part of the discussion? Can you say to communities, hey, look, you're a coal mining community. Look what happened to this other coal mining community, and and to think about that. Is that the kind of conversation you have?
Yeah, that's.
I mean, not specifically coal, but just that kind of thing. Like here's a cautionary tale, and maybe here's a positive tale.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things there. I think one is the issue of jobs. And we at our organization feel that it's really important to recognize the fact that the people who've been working in the coal industry in particular, but also you could make the same case for the natural gas and oil industry. We have all benefited from their hard work and labor. I mean, growing up in Pittsburgh, coal is big industry, steel is a big industry there. And the jobs that people worked helped to power our communities across the country. It was really critical, important work. And so as those industries decline, whether that is for economic reasons, like we're seeing with the rise of solar and wind becoming, reaching parity with coal in terms of cost, we need to recognize that the people who've been employed in those industries need to have a just transition to new jobs. And we really do need to invest in helping them. And in some ways, it's a thank you. It's like saying, you have powered our country for all these years, for these decades. We're not going to just leave you behind. So I would say that on the jobs front. In terms of your other question, which was sort of more toward the environmental legacy of the coal industry and other sort of fossil intensive industries, is that we're increasingly seeing the ways that climate action and environmental justice are linked to one another. And it's not something that people necessarily intuitively think about. And certainly it was a new idea for me several years ago that addressing climate change is going to require addressing a lot of other environmental harms. But that's really where the movement is going. And certainly the youth climate movement, this is just a given for them, that any climate policies need to also be addressing environmental justice. So, as we look at how former coal and oil and gas sites are treating their land, we also need to look at the people living there, right? And say, okay, you've been harmed by the pollution associated with this plant and with this industry. And as we develop a plan for what this site is going to look like in the future, it needs to address the harms that you've experienced to make sure that we are not perpetuating them or exacerbating them.
Well, I think you make a really good point that I've noticed here in the state of Alaska, which obviously also our economy is very strongly dependent on the extraction of oil. And it's hard for people to hear, if you work in the oil industry, it's very hard to hear people saying what you do is bad. Because, I mean, we all know that our personal identity is connected to our jobs. It isn't something we just do to make a paycheck necessarily. And so I really appreciate your comment about addressing that issue of, you're not bad because you work in the coal or oil industry. And we appreciate the sacrifices to go into that. I mean, for people who work on the North Slope of Alaska, that is a really tough job. And I've had some very interesting conversations with people, and they are rightfully resentful of being blamed for this when they work so hard in such a difficult job, frankly, so that we can have the lifestyles that we lead now. So I really appreciate your comment. Violette, you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, so I wanted to give you an opportunity, and then William, I'll call on you too.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this, I guess, in this line of politics. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why. So we've heard about climate change for a long time already. The information is out there, politicians have it, even the worst case scenarios, they know it better than we do. We go to conferences, politicians all over the world, in the US and in Europe, all these UN, wonderful conferences, but then action seems to be lacking at the end of it, real fundamental action. And so I would like to hear your opinion, since you've been involved in these discussions with politicians, on why there's fundamental action still lacking behind, even for politicians to really care and understand it.
Yeah, so I would say that it's a really frustrating problem, obviously, that there's been such a lack of action. Some of it, I think, does have to do with the complexity of the problem, that we are a nation and a world that depends on fossil fuels. And, from the plastic bag that holds our breakfast cereal to the ways that we, get to work or take vacations on planes. We're just so entrenched in a system that's dependent on fossil fuels. So I don't want to minimize the complexity of the problem at all and suggest that it is easy, it's going to be easy to solve. On the other hand, we know that the fossil fuel industry is a big part of this. In addition to enabling the lifestyles that we have, they've been funding campaigns of disinformation for decades and lobbying our politicians for decades and telling them that this is not a human-caused problem for decades. And so those voices are loud. They come along with a lot of money, and it makes it more difficult to do the work that we know needs to be done. So I do think that there are a lot of politicians who are very much on board and would very much like to do something about this. And they are matched by politicians who don't see this as a big deal, or who do, but are callous enough to think that doing nothing about it is an option, right? And that could be for a number of reasons. That could be because they financially benefit from the profits of the oil industry. If you look at our former Secretary of State, for example, who is a CEO of Exxon, or whether their communities benefit from it financially, right? Like Travis was saying, the oil industry employs a lot of people across the country, and there are communities that are highly dependent on those jobs. So I think that there are a number of different reasons why we see that in action, and some of them are genuine in the sense that it's a very wicked problem we're dealing with, and some of them are, more unseemly.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
So there is still an invisible force on the other side as well.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
I want to ask a real quick question, and then William, I'll give you another chance. So Kristy, that seems like, for years, scientists, I think, have felt that if we just explain the science, that'll be enough, right? That we can overcome the disinformation campaigns, and that doesn't seem to work. How much do you talk with people about the disinformation and help them understand that there are organizations and individuals who are deliberately trying to confuse us and delay action?
Yeah, so the work that we do on climate change at the Union of Concerned Scientists is divided into a few different groups. The work I do falls into our climate impacts work. So really trying to understand what the impacts of climate change will be, particularly for communities in the US. But we also have what we call our climate accountability group. And that's a group that helps to point out the disinformation that has been spread by fossil fuel companies. And they've done things like come up with a disinformation playbook that says, look, we don't just see this in the fossil fuel industry. We saw it from the tobacco industry. We see it from other chemical industries as well. And these are the tactics that companies are using to distract you, to mislead you. And so we do try to specifically call that stuff out. We also work, many of you may have heard that there are cities and counties and states who have filed lawsuits against a suite of fossil fuel companies, big oil companies. And we also try to support the scientific underpinnings for those lawsuits to say, okay, you community X are suing these companies for damages related to climate change. Okay, here is the connection between the fossil fuel industry and the amount of sea level rise that we've seen in the past 100 years, for example. So there are ways that we try to, if those communities want to engage in that and are looking for scientific information, we'll try to provide that as well through our climate accountability work.
Thank you. William, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. My question actually does sort of fit in with what Violet was alluded to. She mentioned the rest of the world. So, I mean, I did enjoy your talk, but it was nonetheless biased towards the USA. For example, the ScienceNet that you mentioned, is that only for US scientists, and whether it is or not? How closely do you and the ScienceNet work with scientists around the globe?
That's a great question, and it's something that is a real challenge for us. So I believe our science network is open to scientists internationally. I'd have to double check on that. Most of the work that we do is focused on the United States. And some of that is that there's still so much work to be done here in terms of building momentum for climate action, both within communities and within our government. So we feel that there's we've got a lot of work cut out for us here. At the same time, we need to be pushing our country to be, active in the international negotiation space, which with the new Biden administration, hopefully we'll see a return to that, that kind of willingness to take on a leadership role in the international community. And certainly when we look at the climate impacts that we'll be facing here in the United States, there are places you could point to throughout the world that are going to be much worse off than we will here. So we recognize that the work we're doing on US climate impacts and climate policy really is just part of a broader need of the international community.
Thank you.
So a question we had in the chat was, does UCS make locally specific information available for people to use? That is, if I wanted to know how my congressional district or state was being impacted, do you provide resources that would help people?
We do actually, yes. So if you live in a coastal area, we have fact sheets for every coastal congressional district, with the exceptions of Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico for reasons I can get into if you want.
We're always left out. We're used to it.
No, it's terrible. I'm so sorry, Alaska. So you can download a fact sheet that will talk about the number of homes that are at risk of chronic flooding due to sea level rise in different timeframes for your community. We've also done the same for our extreme heat work. And that is not just coastal, but the entire contiguous US. You can download a fact sheet for your congressional district that talks about the future frequency of extreme heat events for your area. So they're definitely amazing resources if you are wanting to interact with your local representative.
Fantastic. And I'll just mention, we'll put the links to those resources in the comments on YouTube so people have access to them.
Great.
Leo, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a short other question. I realized that this discussion, of course, is mostly US based, as most people here are also in the US. I'm in the Netherlands, like Violetta. I'm not sure if anyone else from non-US is here. I was just wondering.
I'm in Canada.
Okay, that is not the US. Are the Union of Concerned Scientists? I realized that their Twitter handle is USCS or something, so it's a US thing. Does it also exist elsewhere? And are there possible connections with groups like Scientists for Future, who are very strong, for example, in Germany and also in the Netherlands?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Our website is ucsusa.org, simply because ucs.org is held by the Utah Computer Society, and we keep trying to get the domain from them and they keep saying no, so which is totally fine. But I am not sure what our connections are to similar organizations around the world. Our work is really US focused, so I'm not sure that we have any other chapters outside of the US, or that I'm aware of, but I'll look into it.
Okay, thanks.
So I wanted to pivot the conversation a little bit. It seems that, I mean, as far as the different strategies that, climate denial is working on, it seems like a dominant theme right now is climate doomism, just this idea that it's just hopeless, right? And every semester when I teach climate change, I give my students an opportunity to ask me a question. I require every student to ask me a question as part of the assignment. And a lot of the questions are really just in the genre of, is it hopeless? Can we really do anything? And so I was just curious, one is how do you manage that with other people? And also, I'm curious how you manage that emotional element for yourself. I think a lot of us, we wake up in the morning, we read the news, we see yet another story about, what's going on with climate change. And we just, like, oh my God, it can be overwhelming. So I'm just curious, like, how do you manage that emotional element for other people and for yourself as well?
Yeah, it's something I actually think about a lot. In terms of those questions of, can we actually do something? I think those have become much more common questions since the end of 2018, when the IPCC put out a report that looked at the impacts of climate change if we warm by 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees Celsius. And that report was one of the first times that we heard this, this kind of very stark timeline that we need to be on of cutting emissions by 50% by the year 2030. And suddenly you started hearing people say, we only have 12 years at that point to solve climate change. And the reality is that climate change is not a cliff we're going to fall off of. It's a slope that we are steadily rolling down. So if there's nothing particularly magical about whether warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. It would be better than if we warmed by 1.6 degrees Celsius or 1.7. But if we don't meet that 1.5 degrees Celsius target, we're just going to keep fighting to keep the warming as minimal as we can. And to Leo's point of there being tipping points, there are tipping points in the climate system. There is research that suggests that around 2 degrees Celsius, certain systems could, like Greenland ice, for example, could set off a chain reaction. But in general, we see it more as an issue of every degree mattering, not, not that it has to, that everything is hopeless, right? So we have to keep fighting to keep the warming as minimal as possible. And the science suggests that there is still a possibility of keeping warming certainly below 2 degrees C. 1.5 seems like a pretty steep target to meet. We're looking at needing global reductions of emissions by 50% or so by 2030. And that would take an incredible amount of work. And at this point, every month that we're not decreasing emissions gets us farther from that goal. So I would say that it's never too late to be fighting for the future that you want to see. And I think that's where personally it becomes sometimes difficult, right? So the future I want to see for my children is one that looks like today, right? Or my childhood, where they don't have to be making decisions about where to live or settle when they're adults based on the climate dangers that they'll face. And so it does feel sometimes like that future that I want for them is slipping away, right? And with these days and months and years of inaction. But at least for me personally, that just fuels the work more, right? It's like, okay, well, we just need to keep working at this because if they can't have a future that's like my childhood was or like their childhood has been, then I'm just going to keep trying to make it as good as I can, right? And I think there are days when it does feel hopeless, right? And in particular, the last 4 years in the United States, and just watching some of the gains that we had made on climate policy just get clawed back. was incredibly difficult, incredibly frustrating. And that's where community comes in. So I work with a very amazing group of people who, they're the kind of people you can say, I just needed to crawl under my desk and cry for an hour today. Like, this is just awful. And they've been there, right? They know that feeling. And so this group potentially can be that for each other, right? You can reach out to one another, reach out to other like-minded people, connect with a group that's in your local community that cares about these issues, because we all have days where we feel like it's hopeless, and this should have been solved 20 years ago, and now we're in a deep bind. But if you can connect with other people who have experienced that, then we can all help each other to get through those feelings of hopelessness. I'm seeing lots of sad faces in the chat. I don't mean to bring us down, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that we feel grief about this and we feel loss about it. And I think it's critical that we just not get mired in those feelings and let them be a deterrent to action. And it's certainly, if you are an optimist and that is the sort of mental space that you can get in that motivates you, go with it, right? But whatever emotions you feel about this, we need to just turn them into action. So if you feel sadness, action. If you feel anger, action. If you feel hopeful, action. Just keep working.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I'll say, for myself, Astronomers for Planet Earth as an organization has really helped for that, because, for years I have felt like I alone am fighting this, especially in Alaska where there's not a lot of people. And so it's really helped a lot to be part of a group of people that are doing stuff, and that's inspirational and also motivational, because I think part of it is if no one's talking about it and you feel all this anxiety and stress about this thing that's invisible to everyone else, you kind of feel like you're the weirdo, right? You're the only one who cares. And so that's been great. So Violette, I saw you had your hand up. We are approaching the hour, and I do want to be respectful of Christy's time, but maybe if you have a question you'd like to ask, we could go ahead with that.
Maybe just keep it very short. It's not a question. It's sad faces were about mention of Trump, I think. But so what is the most satisfying part of the job that you've done with the union, in terms of feeling you've had an impact, or actually something you've enjoyed doing? And that was my.
Yeah, there's so much that I've enjoyed. I love my role at UCS is a really just stellar combination of, deep geeky research and like the ability to write about it and communicate about it and talk to people about it. So it's been deeply satisfying as a career. But I would say some of the most encouraging and exciting things that I've been a part of are conversations with communities who want to be taking action on climate change. I spoke with a community in South Carolina that is facing really an existential crisis in the next 3-4 decades. And they invited me to speak with their community. A lot of them started off as kind of skeptical about climate change. And it was difficult to communicate the results of our research, which showed this existential crisis they'll face. And to look people in the eye and say, your homes are going to be underwater. And then I watched them turn that information into an amazingly researched climate action plan for their community. And they've brought all kinds of people on board. They have hired external consultants to help them get even more detailed mapping. And so it's really exciting when I see people using our data to make plans to address the issue of climate change in their community. And then I would also say another one of my favorite parts of my job is talking with high school students. They reach out to us fairly frequently when they're doing projects about climate change. I just spoke with a young man in Washington State a couple of days ago about an amazing project he's working on. And just to see the energy that young people are bringing to this issue and to see their willingness to reach out to experts and engage with them is just amazing. So I love just feeling that connection with the next generation of climate scientists and advocates.
It's
Wonderful.
really great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Christy. I want to be respectful of your time, and we have come up on the hour. And so this has been fantastic. I have so thoroughly enjoyed talking with you today. And thank you everyone who's come and asked all these great questions. And Christy, I know I'll follow up with you afterwards with getting the links to those resources, because I know that that's really important for people to know how to be able to talk about how climate change is affecting their communities locally.
It's
So
wonderful. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with you all. It's just been great.
okay, well, with that, we will wrap up. Thank you, everyone. It has been wonderful to see you again. And thank you again, Christy, for being here today.
Thanks.
If you're interested in Astronomers for Planet Earth, you can learn more at our website, astronomersforplanet.earth, and on social media as well. If you would like to be notified about future talks and events, please follow and join us.